I want to welcome Professor Chen. I am very happy to see you. I'm understanding it's very early for you, so we understand your late arrival, but we're grateful that you will be speaking with us, and will elaborate on the proposal of how the Belt and Road is a dynamic reality. And I think this webinar is showing a very dynamic discussion. I'm very grateful for everyone's participation, even for those who could not stay. I think Professor Deason will have to leave approximately sometime before 12, as Professor Geraci had to leave, but I would like now to give the word to Professor Chen. And thank you so much for joining us.
Well, a very early good morning to everyone. I hope I'm awake enough to contribute something that might complement the other panelists who probably have spoken, more or less from a nation state or state-centric interstate perspective. Sorry, I've missed most of the earlier presentations. What I like to do, if I can bring up my PowerPoint. Hope everyone can see it. So my topic is from a different regional scale, even though I will make references to the 20th Party Congress, but I'll go much further back to look at a set of more, I would say, bottom-up, middle range, regionalizing dynamics that obviously have include the Belt and Road Initiative, but going beyond and bring it up to date, with a connection to the most recent development strategy of due circulation that has also been re-emphasized, highlighted by the Congress. If I can start by giving a little bit of intellectual backdrop to my presentation. And here's a recent book that challenges the prevailing globalization narrative by arguing, in fact, the international economy has become more regionalized than globalized in recent years. And the author, O'Neill, based this argument mostly by looking at what she calls 3 regional hubs: North America, the EU, and Asia. By looking at the traditional measure of trade to GDP ratio. And she found that the EU, of course, is more regionalized, because slightly over 60% of the trade is within the EU member countries, where in Asia, it's a little over 50%, where North America lags behind at around 40%. But a couple years ago, I wrote a little book about the BRI, arguing that there's a different kind of regionalization that has been unleashed by the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the framework, I centralized or relocated the source of regionalization, from deep inside China, and looking at its extended and transnational impacts on what I call 3 master processes of globalization, urbanization, and economic development. But today, I'd like to follow that up by making a central point. I argue that the Party Congress and also next year, the 10th year anniversary of the BRI, in combination, really give us a vantage point to reassess China's growing, and I would argue enhanced role in reshaping global regionalization. And this process happening, unfolding both cumulatively from the past, as China's domestic transformation have been reconfigured, and also interactively. And if you look at these four scales or layers of regionalization, go through each one of them in a framework, and also showing some supporting evidence to make the argument and also complement what others might have said about, the geopolitical dynamics. They're mostly driven by national interest and state policies. So if you look at the domestic transformation, I argue that you can go back to the 1980s and to look at what I would call two geographical turns. In other words, the coastal-oriented, export-oriented industrialization, I would say for that really intensified, in the 80s and 90s, that produced the economic miracle of China early on, but also obviously produced domestic uneven development. And then from the late 90s, around 2000, of course, the Western development campaign, or go West or go global. And then the second level of regionalization, I would argue, stems from that and has been intensified and strengthened since the Belt Road Initiative was announced. So in other words, this is the cross-border extension of China's domestic transformation into China's geographic neighborhood, or in terms of international relations scholars, this will be China's near neighborhood. And then, of course, the China-Europe freight train has fostered a long-distance regional connectivities to Europe. And then lastly, I would argue most recently is the looping back of the China-Europe connection back to China's geographic approximate region. So here's a way of thinking about these four layers of regionalization, or regionalism that's in the process of developing. And obviously they are interconnected, but there's a sequential process here from 1, 2, 3, and then now we're talking about 4. So if you look at, again, the first, the origin, right, of this layered multi-scale regionalization, you can really thinking about the drivers behind the first turn to China's eastern seaboard, the coastal cities, starting obviously from Shenzhen, SEZ, open cities, and then the strong integration with the East Asian economic powers, Japan, Korea, the four tigers that produce a shift, of resources, factors of production, migration, raw materials, from China's interior to allow the coastal cities to produce efficient returns on investment. But then if you look at the second turn at the bottom of the table, we see a reversal of redirected state investment, mostly targeting infrastructure, extending some of the special policies that originally only granted to the coastal cities, to the much larger swath of China's interior and the far northwestern border regions, and also the southwestern region bordering Southeast Asia. Of course, the second turn connects now to what we're seeing is the further going west through Central Asia and then to Europe. Okay. Now, if you look at within China, right, we were thinking about how the first turn, the first layer of regionalization now connecting to the third and the fourth, that we see, of course, the western regions of China has been differentially targeted, for doing a different kind of geographical task, so to speak, to link to different segments of the BRI. And I think this is the most crucial way or chart that we should be thinking about. This is very detailed, but really, I think this zone 2 of the central western region of China that I have divided into 3 subregions. So if you look at 2A, B, and C, what you see really is 3 sets of cities, 3 sets of key cities that really have emerged, or in some ways re-emerged, like Xi'an, the ancient Silk Road eastern anchor, has been unleashed again, to serve as the starting point, for sending freight trains to Central Asia and to Europe. And here I would focus, of course, on zone 3A, which is very crucial. This is sort of the middle segment of the Eurasia between China and Europe that connect China to Europe. Particularly, I'll speak a little bit more about Kazakhstan, its special important role. And finally, I think if we look at the European side, the European end of Eurasia, again, we see a growing number of cities that have become important hubs of the Eurasia infrastructure freight train networks. And then the 4A subzone ultimately leads to what I see as emerging as the looping back, Europe, Central Asia, back through China to Southeast Asia, through the land and sea multimodal transportation corridors. Now, about China's neighborhood, I'd like to talk a little bit about China, Central Asia, and then China, Southeast Asia. So if you look at the geographic location, right, Kazakhstan, obviously it is critical. It's smack in the middle, between China and Europe. And then recently we're seeing, of course, there's been lots of drive and lots of momentum from the Chinese side. And more recently, we've seen the Kazakh government have upgraded, improved, energized, their efforts to build the border rail stations opposing Horgus and Alashanko or Alato Pass. And so this is very significant, mostly has been stimulated by the recent SCO conference in Samarkand. And then of course, you look at the bottom, you see, again, this is the planned China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan railway, whose feasibility study has already started and will be completed sometime next year, and then construction to follow from that. And then if you look at the lines, the connecting nodes, I've been to both ends of this railroad, and also both ends of the China-Kazakh freight stations. So now it's really encouraging to see that this remote, somewhat remote, marginalized areas with smaller cities will be connected, driven by logistics-led development. Now, of course, from Central Asia to Southeast Asia, we have seen a lot more established and developed advanced stages of freight connectivity, mostly embodied and exemplified by the China-Laos railway that was opened in December last year. And we're seeing also the development of special economic zones, both on the border and on both sides of the border between China and the Laos. So of course, with the China-Laos railway or CLR, we're seeing the first layer of regionalization from inside China beginning to galvanize or converge to this new gateway city of Kunming, where the freight trains from northeastern, northwestern China begin to run cargo mobility or movements toward Kunming and then across the border into Southeast Asia. On the upper right, we see the city, mega city of Chengdu, very close to Chongqing, which I'll talk about at the last stage as the new land sea corridor. Okay. And so with regard to China and Europe, well, this is the conventional map, right? So the main route in the middle, and then you have the northern and eastern routes connecting through Russia to Europe. But if you look from the European side, right, the cities that normally don't show up or rank very high on the global city hierarchy, cities like Duisburg, Cologne, Dortmund, and others, that really cluster together. So within this region that has a long history of connected heavy industries, Rhine River-based shipping and petrochemicals, coal, steel industries. And within this vicinity, you have multiple modes of transportation, and you have almost 30 million people, consumers, right, that can be easily accessed, from cities like Duisburg. I recently interviewed both the city government, China representatives, and the Duisport business executives who have shared some insights about the importance of China-Europe freight train that go through Duisburg. And of course, the external regional reach from this set of hubs, receiving the trains from China, sending some of them back, have also obviously connected by river, by autobahn, by rail to other European cities that are reaching south and also connecting to the eastern part of the European Union, that also much closer to Central Asia, which I will touch on again to illustrate how the third level or segment of regionalization between China and Europe, linking Eurasia, and will ultimately reconnect back to East Asia, to China through Central Asia and the Caucasus. So obviously the war has a strong impact on disrupting some of the established routes of the trains between China and Europe. But more recently, partially in response to the risk posed by the war, we have seen alternative routes beginning to pick up. And here we see, obviously, the land sea crossing across the Caspian and the Black Sea. And we see on the western side of the Caspian Sea, the overland routes between Baku, Tbilisi, and Kars. Again, a small city in northeastern Turkey, but it's a very well-known historic city on the Asian Silk Road. So the overland connection we see is being strengthened. And more recently, we have seen another movement, another development of the port city of Batumi in Georgia, right? And other than Poti to the north, now have began to connect to Kastan, the Iranian port on the western banks of the Black Sea, and also connections through Turkey and then to Piraeus, to Greece, right? Another alternative route. So what we're seeing here, to summarize, to bring the domestic regional transformation through the two turns, China's growing logistical infrastructure connection to its neighbors, and then the long distance connections to Europe. Now back from Europe, right, through Central Asia, we have the development of the new Land Sea Corridor, or NLS for short, that was launched in 2017 around the city of Chongqing, right? This is one of the 4 special central government administrative regions, and it's the operating center. It's the hub that channels and relays the trains coming back from Central Asia and then extends it to the port cities in Guangxi province or through Kunming along the China Lost Railway. So here we have an illustration of these new routes, right, that coming from the west to the south through Chongqing, and then down further south to Guangxi province that borders Vietnam. And recently I spoke to the Vietnamese Ministry of Agriculture development about the importance of connecting the railways across the border between China and Vietnam. And of course, long and behold, right, as a result of the Vietnamese General Party Secretary's recent visit China and meeting with Xi Jinping, we have the new initiative, between the two countries to standardize and reconnect the standard gauge railway moving away from the century-old 1 meter wide gaugeway that was left by the French. So we see new railway that will connect between Kunming through Lao Cai, Haiphong, Hanoi, another railway that will connect from Guangxi across the border all the way down to Ho Chi Minh City along Vietnam. And of course, we see the cross-border shipping, from the ports in Guangxi, in Qingzhou, that now also accepts trains from multiple cities in China and sends them on to the ports of Vietnam, Malaysia, and ultimately to Singapore, which was originally the design for the southern transport corridor from Chongqing to Singapore. So I'm going to end on this summary 2x2 table to really highlight and stress the critical interconnections between 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So if you start from 1 and thinking about the earlier post-oriented development that has largely run its course in a way that has become matured and established, but now has also accumulated obviously a lot of resources. So a growing number of companies have also over the last few years relocated their operational base and production facilities from cities like Shenzhen and other coastal cities, following the growing westward turn of policy favorability, infrastructure investment, and the launch of some of the key interior cities to send trains to Europe. So we see 1 moving toward 2, and then extending toward 3, and then ultimately it come together in what I would call the 4th box, the lower right, where the domestic regionalization processes and the cumulative benefits of regional rebalancing, regional transformation, recombination of investment, particularly led by infrastructure transport connectivities, have brought many new cities and sub-regions into a growing and expanding network of infrastructure-led growing trade flows, mobility, and ultimately leading to opportunities for many of these left behind places to catch up on development. So I see all of this really as a somewhat quiet, understudied, bottom-up wealth or sources of stimulus and contributions that complements the interstate cooperations that we would like to see happening more and more between China and all the countries around China and beyond China in Europe. So I'll end on that point.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Chen.